everybody, welcome to my channel where we discuss anything and everything to do with mental health and psychology. So the fifth criterion within the KSA is competency in key relationship skills. So let's see what it's asking us to do and what it's about. So what they want to know is if you understand the importance of the therapeutic relationship. They also want to know if you understand the psychotherapeutic skills that are required to facilitate a therapeutic relationship. And they want to know whether you can put this understanding and this awareness of the therapeutic relationship and key psychotherapeutic skills into practice. So are you competent to translate this understanding into your practice? So the things that you need to provide within this skills section of the KSA requires something a little bit different. So it requires self-statement, just like the knowledge section of the KSA, but this section also requires a reference. So this is not an optional. So you need a self-statement and a reference. The person doing your reference could either provide a statement to attest to the skills and the knowledge and the competence that you have, or they can countersign your self-statement. For BABCP, you also need a training course, self-directed study, or criteria from a job or course that you've done that requires you to have competence in the psychotherapeutic skills to be able to get that job or get that place in that course. Does that make sense? So, but it has to be jobs that you've already done or courses that you've already been on. Does that make sense? So just to indicate that you've met the entry requirements for that course or for that job. So how you start to demonstrate that you have competence in key relationship skills. So how I started mine is that I demonstrated my understanding. So I defined therapeutic relationships, so key psychotherapeutic skills. Then I went on to explain why it's important. And one of the key reasons that it's important is that it's the core of effective therapy and treatment. Psychotherapeutic skills can help a person feel supported and understood. It can lead to deeper communication, and that, for example, is the difference between sympathy and empathy. Empathy is not just knowing what someone's going through. It's not looking at their situation and reflecting on it from the outside. It's getting into the experience with them. Does that make sense? So when someone's going through something, you're walking side by side. Empathy is much deeper than sympathy. Empathy is not only knowing what someone's going through, but walking through them with it. So when you're doing therapy, when you're implementing interventions, you're not just hearing what they're saying, you're going with them through it. And you can emphasize this through, let's say, your language or your paralanguage. A paralanguage is anything that's not verbal. So your language can include we instead of I. We're going to go through this together, or we're going to do this. Using, for example, we instead of I, it facilitates collaboration, because therapy isn't something that's done to someone. It's a collaborative process where you and the individual that you're working with are interacting, because they're an expert in their experiences and you're an expert in the therapeutic skill. Does that make sense? So you collaborate to intertwine those things so it helps the individual. Psychotherapeutic skills also includes reflecting, inquiring, being supportive, and saying, you can say if this is wrong, but is this what you're trying to say? Summarizing, reflecting what they're saying back to them so they can confirm and consolidate what they've said. Does that make sense? Or the context of the session. What also goes in that and helps people feel supported is creating a safe environment. And in your essay, you can talk about why it's important for the intervention, whether it's therapy or you're working with someone in a different context, one-to-one. Why is safety important, particularly in the context of mental health? Within that also goes being genuine and being honest. Being honest about confidentiality and maybe the boundaries of confidentiality and its limitations. When you will disclose information, or let's say being honest about the outcomes or the impact of certain behaviours. That includes the care plans if there's contingencies in place to help the person in their recovery. For example, if you're thinking about the care plan, is there contingencies in place? So if they don't follow this part of the care plan, something might happen. Within that also goes having knowledge of the person beyond their disorder and knowing them as an individual, because once you know them as an individual, you can help to know what their goals are, what motivates them, what their cultural needs are, what their values are. Then that allows you to adapt the treatment, adapt the care plan to them as an individual. So for example, eye contact. Different cultures, eye contact can mean different things to different people. Knowing what their culture is and their interpretations of things, why something has value to them, why they do certain behaviours, can be so important to the therapeutic relationship, to the therapy, and it actually being effective for them. Also, by knowing them, you know what motivates them, you also will know their strengths and their resources, and that will help you when, let's say, there's ambivalence to recovery or there's some cognitive dissonance. It helps you to be able to facilitate their change and use techniques like motivational interviewing. Through motivational interviewing, you can find out what works for them, what doesn't work for them, what their goals are, what their values are, what their strengths are, and you can use that to inform your therapy or to inform your intervention. And that's the kind of things that you have to demonstrate that you have an understanding of, because when you have an understanding of those, it shows that you can have a relationship with a client or service user or patient that is much deeper, that is therapeutic, that allows you as an individual, as a therapist, it allows you to implement your training. You can have CBT skills, you can have tools, techniques, but it's you who's almost filtering the technique. Does that make sense? And you're the one the therapeutic technique is coming through you. Does that make sense? So your interactions and your ability to engage people and have that deeper relationship with them in a manner that empowers them, helps them in their recovery, and facilitates them to be empowered by the tools and techniques that you're teaching them. Does that make sense? And I think that's really what distinguishes a good therapist and, I don't want to say bad therapist, but a less effective therapist. Does that make sense? Because you can have the same training, everyone can have equal training, but it's you that's almost teaching the technique. Does that make sense? So your qualities, your ability to be compassionate, your ability to be empathetic, your ability to be aware of your paralanguage and the general language that you use, that's what separates you and almost distinguishes between whether the therapy is going to be effective or not. Does that make sense? You can use evidence-based practice, but this section of the KSA is demonstrating that you have that ability to connect with others on a deeper level that helps them feel safe, that allows them to be empowered. Does that make sense? And with that, even when you're aware of their strengths, they'll be more open about, let's say, their weaknesses or the things that they struggle to do. For example, if a lot of people, they struggle with communicating, especially when things are painful, things are emotional, because sometimes we can be so good at avoiding our thoughts, so good at substituting them, so good at suppressing them, and just so good at distraction that we're not aware of how we're feeling, our thoughts, or even if we are, there's a barrier to being able to actually verbalize them, to know the language of what we're experiencing, or to know how to actually articulate them. Does that make sense? So you might use, for example, if someone's struggling to describe how they're feeling or struggling to communicate how they're feeling, using metaphors, using alternative ways to communicate, saying you can write stuff down, you can write, you can draw, you can use colours, you can use whatever method, you can use emojis, for example, you can use any method that allows us to talk about whatever it is that you're experiencing. Does that make sense? So people might use the word like I'm feeling dark, or I'm having dark thoughts, or I'm feeling blue, or I'm feeling, and it doesn't have to be, okay, I'm feeling blue and that means I'm sad. Is what does that mean to you? Because blue can also mean calm. Does that make sense? Because it's okay that you can use symbolic language, you can use metaphors, and you can use methods that are not saying I'm sad or I'm angry or I'm whatever the language is. It's that, okay, you can go from, okay, well, you're feeling blue. Okay, well, what does feeling blue feel like? Does that make sense? I'm consumed by blue. Now, you can say, is it blue like the ocean? And then they might say, oh, okay, is the blue of the depths of the ocean? Does that make sense? Is a dark, deep blue. So what does that symbolize to them? Are you floating in the ocean? Are you drowning? What's going on for you? Does that make sense? And then even if you know that is communications difficulty, it can help you to be able to communicate. Say a metaphor that you might know, one that I use often is, and I didn't know this at the time when I was writing my KSA, but I use it often now, is thinking about an emotional glass. And everything that happens to you is a drop of water. And over time, let's say you don't have a coping mechanism, over time, those drops of water will build up, right? And you don't have a method of taking water out. What's going to happen? One day, there's going to be that final drop that makes your glass overflow. And then things can feel very overwhelming. Does that make sense? So using that as a metaphor, so it might be, okay, things have been building over time that's made you feel anxious, made you feel low, and at some point, one drop got too much. So it's not that one thing in itself that made me overwhelmed, it's the accumulation of things. Does that make sense? So some people might say, I don't know why that triggered me, or that I don't know why that made me upset or angry, because it's not that big of a deal. Okay, what context did that drop come into your water, into your glass? Does that make sense? You might also want to talk about, for example, empathy when you're overly empathetic. Does that make sense? So then with that, you need to have the skill of being reflective on your practice, being reflective within yourself. And that's part of, within an interaction, there's processes and both internal to yourself and internal to the other person that you're not aware of, but it impacts the therapeutic relationship. So being reflective of your thought process, what's happening internally, that might be impacting the relationship. So if you are overly empathetic, and I use that term very loosely, but you feel empathy to a degree where it impacts your ability to be therapeutic with the person. So now, let's say I'm overwhelmed by what someone's saying to me, then I need to reflect within myself and reflect on the thoughts and the feelings that are coming up. Because me being overwhelmed, we all know with being overwhelmed, it's hard to think clearly when you're overwhelmed. So in a therapeutic role, my head should be clear. Does that make sense? But sometimes, because of our own emotional capacity, what's happening in our lives, sometimes that might happen. So it might be, okay, to have therapeutic skills within relationships, you also need to have a good emotional awareness of yourself, being reflective, being able to use supervision, being able to use resources around you because you know yourself. Does that make sense? Other therapeutic skills include active listening. And define what active listening is. With all these therapeutic skills, you need to define what they are because that shows your understanding of what they are. Does that make sense? So therapeutic silences, what do therapeutic silences mean to you? And what are they? Why are they useful? Why are they not useful? Does that make sense? For example, if silence has go on for too long, that's not therapeutic anymore. Does that make sense? Because then it becomes an awkward silence. But a therapeutic silence might allow someone to reflect on their thoughts, reflect on their emotions, and reflect on what's been happening in the session to almost consolidate their thoughts to be able to articulate them. Does that make sense? So it could be a space where the client is silent, but is it therapeutic? Then a therapeutic silence is actually quite useful in making sense of what's happening and then making sense of their internal world as well. Another point is being open and talking about sensitive topics and being able to manage those sensitive topics and being able to open a dialogue and have confidence within talking about sensitive topics. Does that make sense? So within that, you can talk about, okay, why are they resistant to change? Let's say for example, why are you scared to recover? What's holding you back? What are the fears? What are the uncertainties? What's the dissonance that you're experiencing? Does that make sense? Because sometimes people don't, because if you don't know what cognitive dissonance is, or if you don't know what's quote unquote normal and what's what everyone else is experiencing, because a lot of people, when they're going through mental health issues, they feel alone. And knowing what's going on, because if they don't feel safe, and this is how you can also say the skills interact, because if you allow them to feel safe, then you're confident in talking about difficult topics, suicide, self-harm, any trauma, anything that you're open to talking about, that's going to create that sense of safety. And you being non-judgmental is going to contribute to that sense of safety. Because once a person's safe is when their recovery can be facilitated. Does that make sense? Because they'll be comfortable talking about anything they want to talk about. But then it's also that we're able to normalize what they're experiencing. Does that make sense? And being able to read, for example, paralanguage, you can almost infer what they're feeling. And you can ask them, oh, okay, what went through your mind then? Or, oh, I feel like that made you feel a certain type of way. Or if you say something and they have a reaction that indicates it's wrong, you say, oh, was that wrong? Or you could say if I'm wrong, or showing examples of where you've used them, how they've been effective, and then also showing how they interact in creating a safe environment that facilitates change, that facilitates the person's recovery. And it enables them to not only recover, but be in charge of their recovery, and give them that confidence and empowers them to be able to make full use of therapy or full use of whatever your interaction is. Does that make sense? With that, also talk about how things can go wrong. Therapeutic ruptures they happen, and it's good to talk about it. So mention, okay, therapeutic ruptures. What are they? Why they happen? What could you do about them? Because the worst thing you can do is ignore a therapeutic rupture, and it actually elevates your psychotherapeutic skills when you know how to deal with therapeutic ruptures. Does that make sense? Because they can happen. A patient feels overwhelmed and the relationship might rupture, but how are you gonna reconnect with that patient, or how are you going to reconnect with the client that you're working with, and how are you going to fix the relationship? Does that make sense? Because ruptures are a detriment, and a lot of research shows that therapeutic ruptures between a therapist and a client is detrimental to their recovery. So how are you going to go about fixing it? How are you going to go about dealing with it? And are you going to bring the therapeutic relationship into the session? Does that make sense? So, for example, you notice a rupture, or you feel like there's a rupture, or that you feel like the client's holding back. Bring it into the session. Is there something that I could do to help? Is there something stopping you from talking about certain things? Or what can we do to improve this relationship? Does that make sense? Just being very active with it and being very upfront and forward with it. Does that make sense? One thing you might do is, a lot of psychology jobs talk about emotive environments, distressing environments. Talk about that and what impact does that have on a therapeutic relationship? What skills does that show? Does that make sense? So, for example, if you're met with an emotive environment is a hostile environment, safety. You need to make sure you're safe. You need to make sure those around you are safe. Does that make sense? So, okay, well, in that situation, would you address the therapeutic relationship there, or would you try and manage the situation and then come back with that person when things have settled a bit or things aren't as hostile? Come back, have a debrief and talk about what happened. Apologise for your part in it, because therapeutic ruptures are sometimes both ways, sometimes one-sided. Does that make sense? But take your responsibility in that. So I did the wrong thing and I'm sorry, and how can I make up for it? What can I do to fix this? Does that make sense? And that openness and willingness to accept your own fault and your own responsibility within that also mirrors good relationships to that person. Does that make sense? And even within that anger, when you show that you have understanding for their anger, or willingness to understand their anger and meet them with compassion, even when you're in a hostile environment, even when the situation is emotive, you meet them with compassion, because you understand that, for example, anger is not just anger. Anger is much deeper, and there's a lot of, it's almost like the tip of the iceberg. There is so much more going on underneath the surface that we're not aware of. So, or we might be aware of it. So we acknowledge and understand, or build that understanding to be able to help them. Does that make sense? Even within, for example, language, the ability to define or redefine something for the person, if it's something that requires redefining. For example, if they're talking about I relapsed, okay, what does that mean? Is it a relapse, or is it just teaching us something? Did we learn anything from it? Because if we learned something from it and it taught us something, it's not a relapse. We can have lapses where we might go back to a behaviour or pattern of behaviour or something that we're trying not to do that's not helpful for us. Then yes, okay, we went backwards, but we're still trying. Recovery is not linear. Does that make sense? So taking everything and trying to work out, okay, let's redefine it. For example, if someone sees achievement as only career related or only academic, how did you redefine it for someone? What is an achievement? Achievement is something that you used to find hard that you're doing now. So getting out of bed, that's an achievement if you've struggled with it for so long. And having that redefining of an achievement is anything that's even small steps in the right direction, or small steps that are helping ourselves, or something that was hard for us to do and now we're doing. Does that make sense? So redefining things in a way that facilitates recovery. Give examples of when you've had a good therapeutic relationship, or you had barriers within a relationship and you overcame them, or something went wrong, or there was a rupture, and how you dealt with it. Use examples throughout the essay, and illustrative examples are part of this. So hopefully all of that gave you some ideas of what to write. The whole aim of this section of the KSA is skills. So you just need to demonstrate that you have the skills that someone with a core profession would have. Does that make sense? So you have the therapeutic skills that facilitates recovery, facilitates change, facilitates and empowers clients or service users, whoever you're working with. Does that make sense? And you can also include this in your relationship with co-workers, if you've supervised anyone. It's really broad, but demonstrate your understanding, define things, use examples. So that's it for the video, guys. Hopefully this helps you in completing this section of the KSA. And as I've mentioned in my previous videos, if you have any comments, questions or concerns, please leave them down in the comments. And yeah, that's it for the video, guys, and I hope to see you in the next one.